When it comes to broken add-ons in DBD's history, a large portion of the issues were only ever caused by add-on combos, where two specific add-ons being used in conjunction with each other would just end up being far too powerful, to be fair. In most cases, it was typically two add-ons doing the same thing that stacked, like old Insta-Rev Billy for example, where Primer Bulb and Carbureted Tuning Guide both increased his rev speed to the point where a large portion of the survivor's window for counterplaying was removed. Of course, there were outliers to this trend, where the two add-ons would have completely different functionalities but would create a monster when combined. A prime example of this would be in the Nurse's old add-ons, with Campbell's Last Breath and Wooden Horse, which would allow her to get an almighty 4 blinks with literally zero downsides whatsoever, as Campbell's Last Breath would grant 2 additional blinks, with the downside of making those blinks quite short and less effective overall, while Wooden Horse would increase your blink range back to that original distance, completely offsetting the downside altogether. And yes, it was absolutely ridiculous. Even awful Nurse players could stomp with this build, as every time they missed a blink, they could just keep correcting and adjusting over and over and over again. But the topic of today's video is different from that also, as this add-on was completely and utterly broken on its own, no need to be paired with anything else, and that add-on was none other than Iridescent Head for the Huntress. While the add-on does still exist today, it is very different to the old versions, from both direct changes and outside factors. The story of Iridescent Heads begins on day 1 of the Huntress's release, all the way back in patch 1.6.0 on the 27th of July 2017. The Huntress was considered much better back then. In fact, she was the final piece in the holy trinity of killers, being the Nurse, the Hillbilly and the Huntress, the 3 best killers in the game, with none of the other killers in the roster coming close. Although she only had 5 hatchets back then compared to today's 7, old DBD had more open maps with less random clutter, which meant there was far more opportunity for the Huntress to get more hatchet hits, more cross-map hits, and more zoning pressure. Alongside outside factors making Huntress a simply better killer back then, the Iridescent Head add-on itself was significantly stronger than today's version. While the version you're used to these days limits her to only having 1 single hatchet maximum at all times, back then all it did was reduce her maximum hatchet count by 2. That's right, survivors would have to deal with an insta-down Huntress with 3 hatchets base kit, and with more open maps and less random junk to block hatchets with, you better believe that old Huntress with Iridescent Heads was an absolute menace. Just by equipping this single add-on, the Huntress would be able to practically cut chase times in half. There was no more getting injured and having the chase continue until that second hit lands. No, instead, if you get hit once, you're hooked. The stakes would be twice as high for survivors, as they effectively had half the health, but there was still more to it than that. While yes, there was the raw numeric time saving and pressure gain from having to get half the hits to win a chase, her ability to zone survivors was increased too, as they could no longer make greedier plays at the risk of taking a hit. There was no more taking a hit, only death. So survivors had to play fully at the Huntress's mercy whenever she raised that hatchet, taking whichever path they were forced into and dropping pallets incredibly early the moment they had the chance to do so without the Huntress throwing at them during the drop animation, which in turn brought on even more issues, as survivors would then run out of resources even faster as a result, snowballing things even further out of control. Of course, you may be thinking, well, Iridescent Heads still insta-down people to this day, so how was it much worse back then when we still have the same thing today? Well, there were 4 factors all making things much worse. The first of which we've already spoken about. The Huntress was straight up better back then and had more opportunity to land said hatchets on you. While yes, there were way more pallets back then which would theoretically offset this in the survivor's favour, there was also much more open space back then, as behaviour hadn't yet developed their obsession for placing random shite in every open space they find, alongside every map just simply being bigger. Plus, pallets aren't so one-dimensional with the Huntress, as there's the whole will she raise a hatchet expecting me to drop the pallet or won't she mind game, which takes place at every single pallet. So there's also the added chance for each pallet you drop to mean your instant death too. Another huge factor is that she would still have 3 insta-down hatchets with iridescent heads. Nowadays, the add-on also puts huge pressure on the Huntress player too, as she knows she only has this one single hatchet, and if she misses it, it's pretty much the end of the chase for her. Go to reload and the survivor will be on the opposite side of the map by the time you're done, or commit to the chase and you'll be chasing as an abilityless 110% speed killer, which will also end quite badly. The Huntress player knows this, so they'll typically be much more likely to hold on to their hatchet and zone more instead of committing to the throw. The survivors playing against her know this too, so they'll know which throws and fakes she'll be more likely to make, which also helps them deal with it. But when she had 3 hatchets, all of which insta-down, there's no real pressure put on the Huntress, so missing doesn't really matter all too much, and she's free to be more generous with her hatchet throws if she so desires, which means her mind games won't be as obvious as when she only has 1 hatchet. And that's not fluff either. Don't underestimate how obvious and impactful this can be. In modern day DBD, good survivors can often tell very quickly when a Huntress has insta-down hatchets, even before she's thrown a single one, just from seeing how hard she zones instead of committing to potential throws. These sorts of playstyle differences and telltale signs play a huge role in high-level gameplay, which means since there was no 1 hatchet limit back then, this obvious telltale sign wasn't present, so survivors often had no way of knowing she had iridescent heads until someone was downed by it. The third factor is none other than the inventory belt add-on, which grants the Huntress an additional 2 hatchets and worked with iridescent heads, which meant she could run around with 5 insta-down hatchets, with literally 0 downsides whatsoever. Remember, up until now, all of this raw power was purely from iridescent heads with no other add-ons paired with it. Things only get even more unfair with extra add-ons too. The final factor was Old Flower Babushka and Old Tinkerer, which could also be used with iridescent heads, which granted you insta-rev, insta-down hatchets. Back in those days, Flower Babushka granted 20% faster rev speed, nearly twice as fast as it is today, and Old Tinkerer would add an additional 10% on top of that, granting her 30% faster hatchet wind-up speed while still insta-downing. Considering that Insta-Rev Huntress was already incredibly unfair back then, adding one-shot downs into the equation is just... It blows my mind that this was ever possible to begin with, and it was about as fun and fair as you'd expect. Any Huntress player using these upgraded hatchets would absolutely terrorize survivors, whether they opt for 5 insta-down hatchets with no downside, or 3 insta-down, insta-rev hatchets, and it didn't take behavior long to realize that things needed to change. So, a mere 2 months after the Huntress's release, on the 28th of September 2017, patch 1.7.2 released, bringing in a rather substantial nerf to iridescent heads. Nerf now gives the Huntress 4 less maximum hatchets instead of 2. Full props to behavior for actually acting within a reasonable time frame with an actually relevant change instead of waiting 3 years and making a useless change. But despite the actually substantial nerf, the story of iridescent hatchets was only just beginning. The nerf did successfully achieve one thing, which was balancing the add-on by itself. While the raw one-shot potential was still an absolutely crazy effect, the tables were no longer skewed so heavily in the Huntress's favour, as she could no longer whiff hatchet after hatchet and still have more chances to one-shot. Instead, it brought upon a completely new playstyle and new positives and negatives affecting each of her and the survivor's decisions during chases. No longer having the ability to miss over and over again meant that Huntress players would often find it much more beneficial to focus more on zoning. The one hatchet she did have was extremely powerful, and the survivors knew that too, so they would still absolutely have to respect said zoning or else open themselves up to potentially getting hit by it and instantly losing the chase, which meant the Huntress could use this knowledge and respect to attempt to zone survivors into a bad spot where they're much easier to hit, which could cost a little bit more time but reduces the risk of missing said hatchet. And yet there's still another layer of mind gaming on top of this for the survivors too, because they knew that she knew that they had to respect the hatchets, and as a result they knew that she was expecting them to be much more respectful of that zoning, so they then had the choice of respecting the zone to stay safer now but potentially get forced into a bad spot, or take that risk early and disrespect the hatchet while the shot was still harder to hit in favour of prolonging the chase and not being forced into a bad spot quite as quickly. And of course, it layered even further on top of that, because the Huntress could either respond by taking that risky throw while the survivor disrespected the zoning, potentially ending the chase then and there, or letting the survivor get away with it out of fear of missing. You've really got to appreciate the layers that go into high-level mind gaming in DBD. Sure, this game takes minimal mechanical skill, but damn, the mind versus mind battles go crazy. All of those layers and balance that the nerf brought into this add-on sounds amazing, right? So how's the story of this add-on not over? Well, there was one slight issue. Players could simply equip Infantry Belt and we were back to square one again, as we'd yet again be back to the 3 one-shot hatchets, which were already proven to be far too strong. So you can throw all that talk about mind games out the window, as it didn't matter. Survivors would once again be forced to respect the zoning, because even if she missed the throw, there'd always be more to follow. At the very least, the combination of insta-rev, insta-kill hatchets was now gone. Well, technically it wasn't, as Flower Babushka and Tinkerer were still both in the game, but the choice between 1 insta-rev hatchet versus 3 non-insta-revs was a pretty easy choice to make. Just like the choice to subscribe to this channel. Over 70% of the people watching this video aren't subscribed, so help me out with a sub, it really helps a ton. So the nerf changed it from a single broken add-on to just a regular broken add-on combo, which was at least a small improvement. Needless to say, the Huntress's Iridescent Rampage was far from over, but the downfall had indeed begun. Despite the fast and surprisingly appropriate response with the first nerf, if you're expecting a series of snappy nerfs to follow up, you're unfortunately mistaken. Remember, this is behavior we're talking about. That first nerf happening so quickly was absolutely an outlier. And yet, despite what I just said, this downfall was a continuous and gradual one. But here's the kicker, it wasn't on purpose. Over the course of literal years, the Huntress herself gradually got worse and worse, also by accident. The decline of the Huntress herself was nothing but a byproduct of map changes and the game evolving beyond her era. Maps gradually got smaller, which in turn lowered the value of cross-map snipes and, to a lesser extent, range as a whole. Maps gradually got more and more cluttered with more random trees, random barrels, etc., which also made it much less reliable to hit any shots at all, especially at longer distance, not to mention the addition of more indoor maps like the game and both RPDs, where the Huntress gets all the downsides of being a ranged killer, like reduced movement speed, but none of the benefits, as ranged hits are a rarity on those maps. Keep in mind, the Huntress's hatchets have a much bigger hitbox than their actual model, which yes, does help with hitting survivors in the open, but also makes the hatchets get blocked by things that really shouldn't have blocked them either. As time passed, the Huntress fell lower and lower down the tier lists. Don't get me wrong, she's never been awful like Myers for example, but falling from the 3rd best killer in the game by a landslide to just, yeah, she's alright, is a pretty big fall from grace. For a comparison for some of you newer players, imagine if 3 years from now the Blight goes from being absolutely nuts like he is now to just decent. It's such a big fall off and it's hard to imagine, but for OG players, that's exactly what we saw with the Huntress's downfall. Despite the Huntress eventually flattening out to the top end of average, Iridescent Heads still turned her into practically a different beast altogether. Even if hatchet hits weren't as easily obtainable as they used to be, the raw power from this add-on still stood strong, being far too oppressive with practically no downside. So, 3.5 years later, in patch 4.7.0, on the 4th of May 2021, Iridescent Head got its final nerf. Maximum hatchets stay at 1, but can no longer be increased by add-ons. And just like that, we can finally reintroduce that big paragraph about mind games, respecting the zoning, risking the hits, knowing that the opponent knows what you know, and the add-on finally found itself in a fairer place. Yes, the insta-down hatchet was still a very high reward, but now it was high risk too, upping the stakes for everyone, not just the survivors. Furthermore, the addition of the Soldier's Putty add-on, which increases the Huntress's movement speed to 115% whenever she's out of hatchets, at least gives her a small backup if she does miss her hatchet, allowing her to at least continue the chase as a regular speed killer if she so desires. At the time of making this video, the Huntress received some base kit buffs in the most recent update. Maybe in time we could see her return to her former glory.